Howdy, and welcome to Brandi's Book Stacks Spooky, but not scary, Halloween and fall recommended reading list. So if you're like me, I'm a big weenie when it comes to guts, gore, really, truly scary stories and material. But I really do love a good spooky or ghost tale. And so I thought I'd give some of my favorite recommendations as far as spooky but not scary books are concerned. So that maybe you'll find a new favorite to enjoy this upcoming fall and Halloween season. So without further ado, let's jump into the stacks. So first, I will talk about a book I borrowed actually from my daughter, and that's The Crucible by Arthur Miller. This particular book is sort of a straightforward telling about a story about witches, and then also it's sort of a metaphor for what was going on at the time with Joseph McCarthy and his persecution of communists and pretty much anyone who was a bit different. And The Crucible is a brilliant tale, and it tells the tale of the Salem witch trials. And while I completely believe that The Crucible is brilliant, I'd like to recommend maybe a little bit of a different a tale with the same theme, and that is Lois the Witch by Elizabeth Gaskell. I think this telling of the Salem witch trials, same basic story, is much better in my opinion, and maybe I just enjoy it more because the protagonist is a female, so I feel like I can relate to it a little bit more. And it was, although not contemporary by any means, it was closer to the time in which the Salem witch trials really happened, so I felt like it was a little bit more, I don't know if accurate's the right word, but maybe got the flavor a little bit better than I feel like Arthur Miller did. Either one of them is great, but those are both books that I think are really good for a spooky tale that isn't going to, strike terror into your heart. So another one would be a book I read on my Kindle. And Lois the Witch I also read on my Kindle. It's public domain. And then The Crucible, like I said, I borrowed from my daughter. The next book I read on my Kindle, and that is All Hallows Eve by Charles Williams. Now, this is a little bit of a different take on this spooky. And this one, you kind of combine Christianity and mysticism into this book that is really not like anything else that I could describe. We have a protagonist who quickly discovers that she is deceased. And she is in sort of a shadow universe where she can see and hear things that are going on in our world, but she's no longer a part of it. And she starts to realize that while, she wasn't evil in what we would think of in the strictest sense, maybe she wasn't always the nicest person she could have been. And then an acquaintance of hers is in trouble for her very soul, and she has to decide whether to help this friend or not. So it's really spiritual, and Charles Williams, he's a writer. You're not going to find anything like him anywhere else. I do highly recommend it. It does get into a little bit of religiosity, but I think that's actually sometimes the problem with Charles Williams is he's a little too mystical for the hardcore Christians, and he's a little too Christian for the hardcore mystics. So you kind of have to be okay being in the between. But if you are, it's a great book that's got a spooky but not scary tone to it. Also, I'd say anything by Agatha Christie is great at this time of year. I think her mysteries, usually a lot of them have a kind of a spookier tone to them. I will say Halloween Party is one that's often referenced, and I actually think it's one of Christie's weaker mysteries. I mean, not that it's still Christie, right? So if you want to read that just to get the Halloween vibes, if you will, go right ahead. But I'd pick maybe something like By the Pricking of My Thumbs or something like that instead. Or And Then There Were None. That would be another really good selection. Any of the novels by Anne Perry, they are the Victorian murders, you know, the creepy people in the top, the killer in the top hat as he walks through the streets of London and coming from the aristocracy. Those are really fun to read at this time of year, I think, as well. And Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Those are another one that's, you know, not too over the top scary, but does have some sort of spookier components if you're looking for a mystery. Now on to books that I'll specifically talk about. The first one here is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This is a psychological horror story, if you will. It's about a young governess that takes charge of 2 young children, and something is not quite right with the 2 young children. And as time goes by, as a reader, you come to question whether it's the children that aren't quite right, or is it the governess? And there's some dastardly deeds that happened at the end of this book, and it's one of those where the ending is ambiguous and it's left to the reader to decide. So if that's something that will turn you off, maybe not the book for you, but it is a great psychological kind of thriller that is pretty low stakes. A lot of the books I'll recommend will be classics like this little novella, because typically when you go back in time, you're going to find books that don't have the gore and shock value that something written today would have. And that's why I enjoy them, is I don't enjoy the shock and the gore and the true fear. I don't want to have to go lock my door to read a book. None of these should do that to you. And also this one's very short. As I mentioned, it's a novella. So this book has both The Turn of the Screw and the Aspern Papers. And as you can see, The Turn of the Screw is only that long out of the book. So don't let length intimidate you, because this is a short one. Next, another classic, and that's Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You probably think you know this story. You're like, yeah, it's the guy, he turns into a monster and then he turns back. But the actual base material that came from is so much better than all the derivative crap that you've seen that was based upon it. This is a wonderful psychological story. You really should give it a try. And it's another one that's not this long. I have read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I have not read the other selections in this little book. I may have to take the time to do that. But as you can see, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's really just a little novella. You can read it probably in an afternoon, and it is well worth it. The next one I think is one most people have heard of, and that is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And if you only think of Frankenstein in terms of the universal monster that goes, it's nothing like the book. Frankenstein is actually the monster, and that's another thing to know. When we refer to Frankenstein, usually most people think, this is Frankenstein. Frankenstein is this guy. No, Frankenstein is the doctor that created this guy. So this is Frankenstein's monster. And Frankenstein's monster is very articulate, and he's very philosophical. And a lot of this book is about, what does it mean to be human? And, you know, what does it mean to be a monster? And it's very philosophical, and it's very interesting, but it's not a hardcore horror story. You're not going to find a lot of violence. I mean, I think there's a couple of descriptions of some killings, and it's just, and then this person was killed. There's not a lot of gory detail. So if you're concerned about that, you don't have to worry about that too much with Frankenstein. It is an excellent book. It's not too terribly long. Let's see, Frankenstein is about 242 pages in this version. And it's kind of incredible that Mary Shelley wrote this when still a teenager. You know, her and her friends got together one stormy night and all challenged each other to write a ghost story. And I think it's fairly safe to say Mary Shelley won. Moving on. Another classic, The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. This is another book that talks a lot about, do you have to be an actual monster, something other than human, to be a monster? And who is the real monster? This is a case where there is a mysterious being that is haunting the Paris Opera House. And there is a young girl who sings at the Paris Opera House who this phantom seems to fall in love with. But she already has a boyfriend, and she's not real interested in him. So what's going to happen? Is the phantom going to get mad and steal her away? Or will she get her happy ending? Check it out to find out. Next book is a book I talked about before on my channel, and it's a kind of an undersung one that I don't hear too many people talk about. That's Conjure Wife by Fritz Leiber, and isn't that a great cover? I love that cover. Basically, in Conjure Wife, you have the main character is Tansy, and she, I think that's her name, Tansy. I think that's right. And she is a witch, as are all women. This book kind of explores the idea that behind every good man there is a good woman. And in this novel, all women are witches, and they're all working behind the scenes to further their husbands' lives and careers. Tansy is no exception, and she's working as hard as she can to help her husband along. And her husband catches her with some of her witchcraft supplies. Being familiar with this because he's like an anthropologist, I think, and so he's seen some of these tribal cultures where that's still common for both sexes. And he tells her, you need to put away this superstitious nonsense. Only to find out that puts him in grave danger. And eventually his wife in grave danger. It's a really interesting novel that's different than anything I've ever read. And it's really, really creepy and harrowing, but not to the point that, you know, I have to get up and go lock the door. Nothing truly violent happens in this book. You know, nobody gets injured or anything like that. It's all kind of psychological, but it's pretty strong psychological stuff. So I highly recommend Conjure Wife by Fritz Leiber. Another novel that's a classic that is really great if you want a spooky story is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Rebecca is a young woman who has sort of never been appreciated. She's pretty poor, and she gets, by a chance, introduced into a very wealthy, youngish man, but older than her, considerably enough that, you know, it's difficult for her to kind of find her own way in this story. And he falls in love with her and they get married. But as soon as they're married, there seems to be a secret about her husband. And it seems to revolve around Rebecca. And the protagonist fears that she can never get out of Rebecca's shadow. Rebecca was her husband's previous wife who unexpectedly died. And a lot of mysterious things keep happening. And the protagonist isn't sure if she will ever come out of the shadow of the dead Rebecca. So I don't want to spoil anything for you if you haven't read it, but it's a really good book. I will say this was a really slow burn for me. The first part of the book, I didn't like it particularly, but by the end, it paid off. So stick with this one. If you're thinking, this isn't really going where I want it to go, this is one worth waiting it out, in my opinion. So that's Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. The next one is a classic probably most of us are familiar with if you grew up around the same time I did, because of the famous Disney movie. And that is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. If you've never actually visited the original story, I think it's still just so charming. The one kind of fact that takes the little bit of the luster off is there's some pretty racist stuff in this book. And I can't remember if it was in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow itself or in some of the other stories. But there are some pretty racist descriptions that Washington Irving was responsible for. Outside of that, though, the story of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is just really great. It's just so evocative of a visual image. And the idea of the countryside in fall and how kind of scary it is to go down a lane where it's dark and shadowed really brings that to the forefront. And it doesn't take very long to read that story. This is a book that contains, many of Irving's stories, but that one is certainly the best, and you should definitely give that a reread if all you've ever seen is the Disney movie, which was more faithful than you might expect. But that's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. The next recommendation I have is The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. It's my very, 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 very old copy. And in The Woman in White, we deal with a man who is traveling to go be a governess, or a tutor, I believe is what it's called, to a young lady. A governess, I'm sorry, that would be a female. Tutor. But the woman in white accosts him when he's on the road to go see this lady and ask for his assistance. And it's very out of nowhere. She seems kind of out of her wits. And he kind of sends her on her way, and then she kind of reappears throughout the rest of the story. And it's difficult to tell you more without giving anything away. But this book has got mistaken identity. It's got intrigue, mental illness, some really bad individuals that are trying to commit crimes. It's just a really interesting story with a really good plot. So I would give this one a chance because it's got that sort of creepy mystery. What's going on here? And it'd be really great for the fall spooky season. The next couple of books I would say fall, particularly this first one I'll talk about, fall into maybe the scarier side of some of the books that I am going to discuss. Like I said, especially this first one, and that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is kind of finally getting the acclaim that she has long deserved. This book, if you've seen the movies or seen commercials for the movies and TV shows that are based upon this book, they're not really one and the same, in my opinion. The point of The Haunting of Hill House is much more psychological. And really, I feel like the main theme of this book is more how the scariest thing that can happen to us as humans is social isolation and loneliness. And it's just so wonderfully done. I really highly recommend this. The other book by Shirley Jackson, and I don't like this one as well. It's also a good book, but this is We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And this is another book where there's kind of a creepy mystery hanging about these two sisters that live in their dilapidated mansion who don't, and again, we have this sort of theme of social isolation. They don't really fit in with the local townsfolk who don't like them because they are wealthy and there's sort of a mystery about them. And of course, they don't fit in with the wealthy elites because their house is falling down around its ears and nobody seems to ever repair anything. And it's a real sort of incestuous, isolation story versus an outwardly aggressively scary story. So if you like that sort of thing, I'd recommend We've Always Lived in the Castle. All right. The next book is actually a children's novel, and that is by Ray Bradbury, and it's called The Halloween Tree. And this cover, wow, isn't that spectacular? In this book, we have a group of children, and one of their number goes missing on Halloween. And they are given the opportunity to try to find him, and they have to go through time. And they discover a lot about various traditions involving funerals and the dead and things of that nature. And in the end, they end up having to make a very challenging decision. It's very grown up for a children's book, but it's really worth reading, even if you're an adult. I think it's a brilliant story. Of course, Ray Bradbury is a brilliant writer, so I'd definitely give this one a shot if you get a chance to get your hands on a copy. And I also have another middle grade children's book, and that is the Last Apprentice series by Joseph Delaney. And this book is about a group of people called the Spooks, or in this case, there's a spook, and they have to have an apprentice, and their job is to keep their community free from evil. And all of the apprentices have fled except for the very last one, and this is the sort of his story. And it's about witches and the complicated nature of sort of, are witches evil or are they? So this is a pretty good middle grade. I never did get a chance to finish the series. I had read the first 4 books. And someday I'm going to have to go back and get the remaining ones and finish up the series. But it is a good one, and it's got very, fall, creepy kind of vibes to it. But it's not too scary. It's a middle grade. It's meant for kids. So a lot of times I'll do that. I'll read a book that's meant for kids because I know it's not going to be too over the top for me. Finally, this one's big. I have a graphic novel by James Owen. This is Star Child. And you can get this in a less fancy pants copy. My husband got this for me one year for Christmas because I was a fan. And this is a very fall-based book. It's sort of about the singers that tell, the storytellers that tell the story of the world. And then when they tell that story, it becomes reality. And then there's just a bunch of tales that take place in a pub, and it's all very, very fall driven. And it's got some pretty artwork in it. I'll just kind of flip through so you can see. And it is a very, very autumnal sort of, you can kind of tell by some of the pictures. Autumnal stories, and it's worth giving a read. You can find this, I think, on Amazon in a less prestige-y copy. And I would recommend giving it a read because I think it's something a little different, being a graphic novel to read during the quote-unquote spooky season. So next, I thought I would talk a little bit about my TBR and what I'm sort of planning to read for this Halloween season and spooky season. One of them, and I probably will not read all of these. These are just my sort of potential picks, if you will. So first we have Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. This is one of the first true crime stories, and it's Truman Capote's writing. And the only thing I've ever read by Truman Capote so far has been his Christmas Memory, but I loved that. So I really wanted to give some of his other works a try, and so This is one of the ones, since I particularly enjoy mystery and true crime, I thought would be a great read. So I may pick this up this fall to read. Next, I have Anne Radcliffe, The Mysteries of Udolpho. This novel is supposed to be one of the great Gothic novels, and is supposed to have some sort of creepiness to it. So I don't know that much about it other than that. I picked this book up for a nickel when one of my local half prices went out of business. But I thought this might be one that I give a shot. The only thing that might turn me off of it is pretty long. It's almost 700 pages, so we'll see. Maybe I'll get to that one. Mentioned before liking Ray Bradbury, and this is one I actually haven't read, and that's Something Wicked This Way Comes. Of course, one of his famous horror novels. And I don't think it's, over the top violent or gore. We may find out if I get into it, and I'll let you know. But that's one I've kind of been thinking of picking up. I recently got this book, and I very, very well may read this one. This is a movie novelization of a Disney movie that I watched when I was a kid called The Watcher in the Woods. It's supposed to be kind of a spooky story. So I thought I might check that one out, since I recently bought that, and see what that's all about. Another one, Roald Dahl, The Tales of the Unexpected. So Roald Dahl, being a very famous writer who wrote a lot of great short stories, and of course is well known for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, probably most of all. But he also wrote a lot of adult fiction as well. So I'm kind of excited to look at this and see if I enjoy the short stories. So, and of course you cannot talk horror and spookiness without talking about Edgar Allan Poe. And I have read some of Poe's stories, but certainly not all of them. And this is one I may want to actually go through this spooky season. The Fall of the House of Usher is one of my favorite stories of all time. But I haven't read a lot of his other famous ones. I haven't read Murder at the Rue Morgue, which I'm really excited to pick up. So that might be something I will at least read some of the stories in this novel over the fall season. I also picked up this other book not too long ago, talking about a master of short stories, and that is The Dark Side of Guy de Maupassant. And Guy de Maupassant is probably my favorite short story writer. He's just brilliant, and I'm not huge on short stories, but Guy de Maupassant's, you got to make an exception for him. So I thought this might be a really good kind of spooky fall read. And the last book, second to last book on my list is Lolly Willows, which I heard a description of this, I think, on Miranda Mills' channel. And I just remember thinking it sounded like a really, really weird witch story. And it was really hard to find a copy online. I tried looking and couldn't find one anywhere at the time. And I think since I had been looking, it became a Book of the Month book. And so it was at my local half price, this really nice used copy for $8. And I thought, why the heck not? I had such a hard time finding it when I first started looking. So this is one that I very well may read this sort of fall, Halloween, spooky season. So that's it. Those are the books that I think are spooky but not scary and worth reading. Have you read any of these books yourself? Have you read any of the books on my planned TBR and are going to say, hey, wait, stay away? Or are you saying, oh yeah, you better give that one a shot? Let me know in the comments down below because I'm interested in your opinions. Maybe you'll drive me to the right thing to read for this spooky season. And hopefully you got a few ideas from me of maybe some books to try that won't scare the pants off of you, but that you can enjoy. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to click that bell, subscribe, and we'll see you later. Bye.